Hi, everybody. Eve Harow, Director of Tourism and Community Development for Win Israel Fund. So happy to welcome you to tonight's webinar. I'm based in Israel right now. Tonight is, I think it's January 5th over here. I don't know where it is where you are. Win Israel Fund, as many of you know, is the organization that helps to support the communities in Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza envelope. We just had an incredible mission here last month, where we spent almost the entire time in Judea and Samaria, meeting the people, seeing what's going on. I think it was, for anyone who was on that mission, I think it was pretty unforgettable. I've been running day trips as well. If you're going to be in Israel at the end of January, whatever intercession there is, we're running a trip on January 18th and also on January 23rd. There is still room on the buses, so you're welcome to go into the Win Israel Fund website and to sign up. And I hope to see you here. In the meantime, I am really delighted to have an old friend on tonight. Professor Richard Landes has been, well, he's been doing a lot of investigations for about the last 1,000 years, even though he doesn't look that old. He just put out a new book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism and Global Jihad. And I worked with Professor Landes many years ago because, you know, many of us realize now that much of what we're seeing on the news is manipulated. We're going to watch a video and we're going to see that it's taken out of context, and in many ways, and almost always, to make Israel look bad. But one of the first people to really investigate this and who coined the term pallywood was Professor Landes. And that was what, 15, 20 years ago? It's part of the book. It's part of the history of the book. Anyway, welcome to the Win Israel Fund webinar.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
I hear you. Is this better? What happened to the?
I hear you.
Oh, you hear me? Okay,
yeah.
So I'm going to call you Richard. We're just going to go that way. So tell us a little bit about, well, why you wrote this book. It's kind of like a compilation of much of the research and much of the work that you've been doing in the last few decades. But your background didn't really set you up for this, or did it?
Well, I think in a sense it did. I mean, I was trained as a medievalist, and one of the things about medievalists is early in the post-war period, when the CIA was first forming, they actually consulted with medievalists because medievalists are trained to reconstruct a situation based on fragmentary evidence.
And so, particularly medievalists?
Yeah, particularly medievalists, including my professor at Princeton, Joseph Strayer. And one of the reasons they did this is, as I said, because we're trained to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. And so, you know, I'm dealing with a situation in which I only have fragmentary evidence, because I'm not a feet on the ground journalist who's, you know, confronting stuff directly. But certain patterns of behavior struck me as clearly embedded. And for me, you know, you mentioned that I coined the term pallywood. It occurred to me in 2003, I was investigating Muhammad Dura, and I got a chance to see the rushes from the sort of uncut footage that the Palestinian cameraman Talal Abu had sent to Charles sitting with Anderlin.
But perhaps just remind our viewers what
Charles Anderlin Charles Anderlin is an Olef from France who was in the army and served in Dover Tzahal in the IDF spokesman's unit, and then became the chief correspondent for France 2, which was the major national news chain. So he was, you know, he wasn't replaced. He was sort of permanent. So he was probably one of the most senior journalists based in Israel, covering the Middle East. And he's the one who ran the footage of the boy Muhammad Dura behind a barrel, shot in cold blood by the Israelis, using basically faked footage, which he then edited to make look real and showed to the public. And I'm looking at the original footage. It's about 45 or 25 minutes long, and it's nothing but people standing around. There's no action. Every once in a while, you'll see people faking stuff, like somebody will sort of throw his arms up, fall down on the ground. Of course, his hands come to break his fall. And then a bunch of people come and grab him and carry him off to an ambulance. in front of the cameras, and the ambulance goes off, and if he had actually been injured, that kind of treatment probably would have done him in. But and there was one scene that was particularly comic. I won't go into it because we don't have the time, but the Andelins French cameraman who was seeing the footage for the first time was there, and he laughed. And I said, "Why do you laugh?" He said, "Because it looks so fake." And I said, "Yeah, all this stuff looks fake." And I turned to Andelin, and he says to me something that just blew me away. He said, "Oh yeah, they do that all the time."
Wow.
Yeah. And so what I realized was, I had been studying the footage from a Reuters cameraman with Nachum Shachaf, and there you could see the fake. So I knew the Palestinians faked, but it didn't really occur to me that the journalists would then take these fakes and turn them into news.
They were
And that's
complicit.
when And that's when I realized that it was an industry, because they were not only the producers, but they were the consumers. And that's when I thought, it's like Bollywood, it's pallywood.
Wow. And how
Yeah.
many millions of people have been affected by this because they're sure that what they're watching is the truth?
Well, the theme of my book is that basically what happened, the Dura, I call it a blood libel. It's not the traditional medieval blood libel of, using the
Matzahs.
blood of
Right.
a Christian child for matzah, but it is a blood libel in the sense that it is an accusation against the IDF of deliberately killing children,
Yeah.
Palestinian children. And the deliberate is the key thing. And when Odella, did the broadcast, he said, here's a father and son, the target of fire from the Israeli position. He had no reason to say that. And in fact, all subsequent investigation shows that it couldn't have come from the Israeli position and most likely came from the Palestinian position. So, we don't know what happened, but people were so convinced that the kid had died in this event that when I would talk to people, I'd say, look, there are five possibilities. Israelis on purpose is by accident. Israelis, Palestinians by accident, Palestinians on purpose. And I'd wait for them to say staged, and they'd say the journalist shot him, or the ambulance driver shot him. But it never occurred to them, and this is back in
20 years ago.
2005, it never occurred to people then that the Palestinians were literally staging stuff constantly. So I did the Pallywood movie first just to establish that possibility before I did the documentary on Dura, trying to show that it was staged. And then I did a third documentary, and these are all available at the website aldura.com.
Okay, someone just asked where they're available, so perfect.
Right. Yeah, so they're all available. And the third one was called Icon of Hatred, and it was about the unbelievable wave of hatred that this story of the IDF shooting the boy in his father's lap triggered, both in the Muslim world, where it was a call to jihad, and bin Laden used it in a recruiting video, and in the West, where you have this insane disorientation in which a major French journalist said, this picture erases the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. So the shot of a kid,
Wow.
right,
Wow.
the shot of a kid who's not even, it's not clear what happened, but even a kid killed in a crossfire replaces a picture that symbolizes the deliberate murder of 1 million children. How morally and empirically disoriented can you get? And yet that attitude literally swept, particularly Europe and the progressive left, who adopted it whole force.
So you talk about this in your book, and I mean, in general, this terminology, lethal journalism,
Yeah,
which is a very strong expression.
right.
Yeah. That's where you turn what happened with Dura. Yeah.
Yeah, Yossi Cooperwasser was the one who
Right.
coined it, working off of Nidra Polar's essay called Lethal Narratives. And the whole point of a lethal narrative is to incite hatred against the person that you're framing with your narrative. And so legal journalism I define as journalism. There are three kinds of war journalism. There's patriotic war journalism, which is you tell your own side's propaganda as if it were news. And that's the norm. And modern journalism tries not to do it. The second is when you're covering a foreign fight, you tell one side's propaganda as news, which is what the journalists do here with the Palestinian propaganda. And the third is actually, I think, pretty much unheard of, but I would argue dominates the 21st century, which is own goal war journalism, in which you report your enemy's propaganda as news to your own people. And that's effectively what the media has done, because they keep presenting the Palestinians as freedom fighters when they're jihadis. And so
how do
they're
you explain this? Where's the why here?
Where's the what?
The why? How do you explain this?
Okay. All right. So I think
it's a question, right?
Right. It just goes straight for the, okay.
Why not?
So
we're short on time.
Right. So my argument in the end of the book is that it's something like a perfect wave of three factors. One is the journalists are enormously intimidated here. They know Hamas intimidates them. In 2000, they were so intimidated that, when the lynch at Ramallah started, the Palestinians just rounded up everybody's stuff, and anybody who didn't give them, any journalist who didn't hand over their cameras got beat up. And so on the one hand, there's this intimidation. I think it's enormous, and I think it's a kind of public secret. Nobody wants to admit it. And there's a kind of, I would argue,
it's also not just in Israel. I mean, wasn't it? Who was it? Easton Jordan of CNN,
yes,
right?
In Iraq.
Where he said under Saddam Hussein, like, I wouldn't have gotten access or been able to report if I'd actually reported the truth of what was going on.
Exactly. So one other version of this is access journalism, but access journalism is relatively civilized. Intimidated journalism is you're literally afraid for yourself. So there's that. The second thing is that post-colonial ideology identifies the Palestinians as people of color, as indigenous population that's been colonized by a European foreign colonial presence. And that serves really well as a kind of fig leaf for the intimidation. You don't have to admit the intimidation because you say, no, I'm just siding with the underdog. And the third thing, of course, alas, is that there's an enormous appetite in the West for what I call moral schadenfreude about Israel, which is the thrill that people get when they hear stories about Jews behaving badly. Somehow that just has enormous appeal. And journalists understand this. They understand that, Richard Kemp was interviewed by the BBC, and they made the mistake of asking him what he thought of the Israeli army. And he said, it's by far the most moral army in the world. That's the last time Richard Kemp got on the BBC to talk about the Israeli army. They didn't want people to hear that.
And he's a Christian altogether.
Right.
He's an amazing human being.
Right. Yeah. And a colonel. So one of the things that you have then is this sort of combination of three things that literally poison the information systems of the West. And you end up with a situation like BDS on campus. You end up with the situation of the president of the United States, upbraiding Israel for having a minister go on the Temple Mount and follow all the rules of the status quo. But nonetheless, this is unacceptable behavior. You have a UN that's insane. The key thing, there was a key moment in all this, and that's just before 9/11, there was a conference in South Africa at Durban that was supposed to be against hate and racism and so on and so forth, and it ended up being just a frothing at the mouth attack on the twin Satans, Israel and the United States. And it's really the point, I would argue, of the marriage of the progressive left, especially the NGO progressive left, on the one hand and the jihadis on the other. And people were literally carrying banners of not just Saddam Hussein and Yasser Arafat, but of Osama bin Laden. And when Fiamma Nierenstein said to her editor in New York, in Italy, you know, there are pictures of Osama bin Laden, her editor said, leave the camel driver alone.
Wow.
Yeah. So, you know, and then you have this, and then Jenin, which is, so the second chapter is about 9/11. The third chapter is about Jenin. And what you have as a result is a sort of a situation in which jihadis are attacking democracies, and the leaders, the thought leaders of the democracies are blaming the democracies. I call it Y2K mind because it really seized in 2000. The first attack on a democracy by jihadis in modern times was the attack on Israel, and it was reported as, you know, Israel's fault. And 9/11 happened. The Reuters and the BBC applied the same logic that they had been applying to Israel about not calling terrorists attacks. And they refused to refer to 9/11 as a terrorist attack. And the Americans who wanted to refer to it as a terrorist attack would then say, but it has nothing to do with Israel because, you know, Hamas is a national movement. No, Hamas is not a national movement.
There's legitimate terrorism and there's illegitimate terrorism. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to this day on sites like Wikipedia, if you look at jihadi terrorist attacks, Israel doesn't appear. It's not considered part
a victim of jihadi. Wow.
Considered a victim of jihad. So you have a West that's fundamentally disoriented, dealing with an enemy, and literally almost every move it makes encourages the enemy, which is why the original title of my book was "They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid." And I have, as my daughters told me, I can't insult my readers. I said, even we're so stupid, and they end up fooling everybody. But the epigram I wrote for the book was, if I were a Muslim, I would consider the stupidity of Westerners as a sign from Allah that I should join jihad. And when I showed it to Tariq Fatah, who is a genuinely moderate Muslim in Toronto, he said, oh, I have a number of jihadis who say that.
Really? So it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
They're just playing. They're playing with the West.
Literally been, and particularly the lethal journalism about Israel. I mean, you know, one of the things that Hillary Clinton and Kerry used to say, don't refer to radical Islam because we don't want to play into the jihadi narrative that there's a war between us and Islam. Okay. So, but all the lethal journalism about Israel is essentially, you know, a red flag in the face of a bull. This is, every time you get the Jenin massacre, or, you know, what happened at Kafr Khana in Lebanon, or what happens in Gaza and so on, every time these images go out of Muslim victimhood and Israel is portrayed as a ruthless murderer, it is a huge spur to jihad. So the attitude is sort of double. We won't identify our enemy, and we will run footage that infuriates them.
You know, I'm just thinking, because your background is so interesting. I mean, most of the people that I interview, most of the people who are involved in modern day lethal journalism or what's happening in the world have, you know, they're grounded in a modern education for whatever it is. And here you are, where your thought process and a lot of your research is literally 1,000 years ago. And you know, and in a minute, I'd like you to talk about that because it's really almost 1,000 years. Right. But when you go back to where this all started, really the hatred between the Christians and the Muslims, that's all over the Mediterranean, including the land of Israel. I mean, it starts even before the medieval period. It starts really with the advent of Islam. So when you see it in a broader scope, at least that's how I look at it, this is a continuation of an old story, but it seems because now the Jews have some power here that we rocked that particular boat. right? Between, I mean, if it's the Crusades or if it's Saladin. So how do you see this? I mean, because you can do for us tonight what a lot of people can't do as a historian, and
Right.
put this in a larger context, in a larger frame. And then
Right.
maybe we can also figure out where we're going, maybe.
Maybe.
given
So,
hundreds of years of history.
So in fact, the point of the book is to say, look, there was a psychologist who coined the term cognitive egocentrism. And he did it in describing teenage boys who could think of nothing but sex and assume that everybody else thought of nothing but sex. So cognitive egocentrism is when you project your mindset onto other people. So in the book, I distinguish between liberal cognitive egocentrism, which projects a liberal mindset onto others. If we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us, wish the other, welcome the other, and the other will welcome you. And dominating cognitive egocentrism, which is rule or be ruled. I have to rule over you, lest you rule over me.
Mm-hmm.
And the latter is actually a very old mindset. It's a mindset that's built into what I call shame honor cultures. Anthropologists have since dropped this discussion, but I think it's terribly important.
Yes.
People in the Middle Ages are largely driven by a zero-sum honor shame mentality in which I get honor by shaming you. My being raised up is connected to your being lowered and degraded. And so, for Islam and for Christianity, the sort of supersessionist attitude, which is we have the true religion, and the people who came before us who claim to have had the true religion have been, erased and replaced by us. That's really a zero-sum notion of chosenness. It's, in order for me to feel chosen, you have to be unchosen. That's what the Christians said. And then when the Muslims took over, they said it to the Christians and the Jews. So, and I think part of our problem is I have a whole section in the chapter on shame honor culture in which I discuss the Oslo peace process and the way in which it was completely misread because the people who were running it in the West, Israel and America, and the Norwegians and stuff, were all convinced by this positive sum, generous land for peace, negotiated settlement, and they didn't understand that any victory for the other side is a loss for your side in the zero-sum honor shame world, and that to get something by negotiations it's a shanda. As Nasser said this, and it was repeated a lot, and it was even on the wall over Muhammad ad-Dura, the footage on Muhammad ad-Dura, which is that which was taken by force can only be retaken by force. So here are all these Westerners thinking, we're so close, we were so close. And then, if only, Barak had been
right, or Sharon hadn't walked on the Temple Mount or whatever.
Right.
Yeah,
he would have said yes. No, he was never going to say yes to this. And the lack of understanding of how powerful this zero-sum honor shame mindset is at the core of our inability to understand what we're dealing with. So in a sense, the theme of the book is that the West has been attacked by a medieval apocalyptic millennial movement that wants to conquer the world. And they say they want to conquer the world. They want a global caliphate. That's why I call them caliphators. And couldn't even recognize or even name the enemy. So what does Bush come up with? The war on terror.
right.
So he doesn't even know who the enemy is. And we have been paralyzed by our inability to acknowledge that we have an enemy because, we're nice people. Why would we have enemies? And if they have enemies, it must be because it's our fault.
Right.
But it can't be because it's their fault. So that's the sort of major theme. And in terms of, what happened here, and again, I deal with this in the book, is that when Jews became independent, autonomous population in what should be Dar al-Harb, what should be Dar al-Islam, and the Jews should be dhimmi, they should be subject peoples. When they became free, it was literally viewed by triumphalist Muslims as an insult. And I define triumphalism as a belief that in order for you to feel good about your religion, in order for you to feel that your religion is right, it has to dominate in the public sphere. It has to be visibly superior. And when Jews are no longer acting as if Islam is visibly superior, that's viewed as an unbearable insult. And I think that was what was behind this still ongoing, although I think weakened, but still ongoing Muslim rejection of the state of Israel.
So it's really because we humiliated them and they're upset about that, if you have to put it this way.
And they have to take vengeance. In other words, the only way to wash a blackened face is with blood. And we blackened their face in 48. The Nakba is not what happened to the Palestinians who ended up in refugee camps. The Arabs put them in refugee camps. The Nakba is what happened to the Arab leadership that said they were going to wipe us out and looked like fools in front of the world community.
So, I mean, to go back again to the millennialism, the Christians also used to feel this way, maybe even more so than the Muslims. So just to segue for a second, what happened? And if it happened to the Christians, let's assume, and we'll explain, obviously, could it happen to Islam?
Yes. So I argue that my argument about monotheism is that at its core, certainly at its Jewish core, is what I call demotic religiosity. And demotic comes from the Greek word demos, or people, and it means the whole people. And what it means is it's a religiosity that empowers everybody, not just the elites or not just the common people, but everybody is equal within the polity and everybody is treated fairly according to their merit. So demotic religiosity, which honors manual labor, as opposed to viewing manual laborers as sort of stigmatized, which believes in equality before the law, which thinks that everybody has a personal relationship to God and should have access to the sacred texts and so on. This kind of demotic religiosity became very strong in Europe, particularly after the invention of the printing press and the translation of the Bible. And people gravitated to the Hebrew Bible and gravitated to this kind of teaching. And in America, it was particularly strong. And when the revolution happened in 1789, when the Constitution of the United States was ratified, the doctrine of religious freedom represented the first time in the history of Christianity that the winners were tolerant. Up until that point, tolerance was either a loser or a minority's creed. There should be freedom of religion so that we can be heard. But once they took power, they decided that they'd been given power by God, and therefore everybody should follow them. And the American Revolution was really the first time. And I think that both democracy and this demotic religiosity have shaped a kind of Christianity that doesn't have the same problems with us as the supersessionists, really pre-modern Christians. Now, the fact that so many people call into question the existence of the state of Israel, to some extent, that's really quite an astonishing phenomenon. Napoleon was alleged, and I think it's a genuine letter, but we only have a late copy of it, was alleged to have written a letter inviting the Jews to come back to the land. And he says, come back and regain the sovereignty that has been so shamefully denied you by the nations. And what he meant by that is people who believe in freedom believe that Jews should have freedom, and people who believe in dominance believe that dominating the Jews is a proof of their superiority. And so, normally you would think that Democrats and progressives would be on the side of Israel. And yet, I think, and I talk about this in the book, and I've written an article on it, which has been rejected now 4 times, about progressive supersessionism. In other words, even though they're not religious, I think the progressives believe that they are the moral cutting edge of the planet, of the globe, and that their only real competitors are the Israelis. And as a result, they have this same kind of reaction that a Christian supersessionist has or a Muslim supersessionist has, which is bad news about Jews gladdens their heart. And, go back to the perfect wave I was describing at the beginning. I think, unfortunately, there's a very strong strain of zero-sum supersessionism amongst progressives, in which they see Jews as their enemy. And, at the turn of, after Dura and the beginning of the Intifada, there was a guy I saw regularly at an annual conference who was a real progressive. And he said to me, how did he put it? This time Israel has lost the moral high ground. And I kept thinking, how do you lose the moral high ground to people who teach their children so much hatred that they want to go out and blow themselves up amongst the children of another people? And then I realized it wasn't that we had lost the moral high ground to the Palestinians, we had lost the moral high ground to the progressive left. They were now high up looking down at these poor tribal squabbling peoples of Jews and Palestinians, trying their best to bring about peace. But those Israelis.
Wow. And you're talking about a good number of people who themselves are Jews when you talk about the progressives.
Yeah. So now that's the interesting thing. I do have a chapter. You are a good questioner. I have a chapter called Jews Against Themselves. Which is a term that Edward Alexander coined in a book called Jews Against Themselves. It's a brilliant book. I wrote, I think, a pretty good review of it. So dealing with that is really hard because it's a form of what I call masochistic omnipotence syndrome, which is it's all my fault, and therefore, if I could only be better, I could fix anything. And so you have the response to the Intifada amongst both the Israeli and the Western Jewish progressive left is to say, if only we had given more, then it would have worked. And it's our fault that it didn't work. And so it's it's an omnipotence, syndrome. It's like, it's in our hands. And I remember when I first moved to Israel in 2005, I met a number of people and I was talking about these things. And one of them said to me, it was in 2000 that I realized, Zelo b'yadenu, it's not in our hands. And that's something that people have an enormous amount of difficulty acknowledging. So they end up becoming what Manfred Gerstenfeld called, Zichrono livracha, humanitarian racism, which is, I don't expect anything of other people. Palestinians, if Sharon goes to the Temple Mount and they start a suicide terror campaign, it must be Sharon's fault, because how can you expect the Palestinians to control themselves? I mean, Stephen Breyer actually at one point posited that it might be considered not a question of freedom of speech to burn a Quran, which some guy in the South threatened to do, because it would be like crying fire in a theater. So in other words, the kind of natural gut reaction of people in a crowded theater who hear fire to panic is then compared to the rage of Palestinians, or the rage of Muslims, if you burn a Quran. So there's a real, it really is a form of racism.
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
They're not capable of controlling themselves.
Exactly. And
Okay,
the corollary
is country, but they can't control themselves, and we just have to. But it's our fault, so we just have to suck it up, and that's how it is.
Yeah,
it's such a confluence of things that make no sense.
Well, it's a confluence of things that unfortunately make too much sense to the people who are locked into them. And the book is an effort to get people, to show people a way to sort of break the thrall of this worldview, which is so destructive of the very liberal values that it's supposed to embody.
Mm-hmm. So the title that you do choose, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? So that's a fascinating title, because even among people who are pro-Israel, and I've spoken to so many gazillions of people over the years, and people will say to me, look, I love Israel, but it can't be that everybody else, what we're saying about Israel has no basis in fact. It's just like where there's smoke, there's fire. There has to be something going on here.
Exactly. And I think it's very hard for a lot of people, and so for instance, in 2002 with the Jenin massacre. So actually, let me briefly go over the source of the title. There's a quote from Echad Ha'am. He wrote an essay called Can Everybody Be Wrong, the Jews Be Right? And it was about how people in his day, 1892, in Eastern Europe, would respond to Jews saying, we don't eat the blood of children, Christian children. And they would say, can the whole world be wrong and you guys be right? And the second one was Kofi Annan in response to the alleged massacre at Jenin, saying, I don't think, he didn't even ask the question. He just said, I don't think the whole world can be wrong and Israel be right. And in fact, that's exactly what it was. It was literally an emperor's new clothes. It was, the IDF was accused of massacring and bulldozing in mass graves Palestinian civilians. Nothing like that happened. The final count was 3 weeks of urban warfare. The final count was 56 Palestinians dead, 41 or 2 were combatants. So that's like a 3-to-1 combatant to civilian ratio for urban warfare, which is unheard of. It's the reverse of the norm, which is 1 combatant to 3 civilian casualties. And yet the world heard this story. The lethal journalist repeated it ad nauseum. And as a result, you literally had Jews who were saying, people like Tony Judt, who was a brilliant historian, saying, the Israel is endangering the Jews of the diaspora. And, basically he had a choice between, do I believe these reports of massacres or do I question the Western media? And clearly questioning the Western media never occurred to him. So yes, you have this situation in which the whole world can be wrong, in which the sort of the nut, every time you hear somebody talk Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know that you're dealing with somebody who's already a prisoner of the Palestinian David-Israeli Goliath conflict. Arafat didn't say no because of the Palestinians. In fact, probably most of the Palestinians wish he had said yes. And certainly, in retrospect, after the fence goes up and their lives are much less well off than they were in the 1990s. In retrospect, they sure wish he had said yes, but he was dealing with a much larger Muslim honor group. And the real conflict is the conflict between free autonomous Jews and triumphalist Muslims. It's not a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israelis have been hijacked by their leaders and sacrificed by their leaders.
Yes, we have. So, you mentioned when we talk about the campuses, and you as a professor, so normally when we talk about the campuses and that this ideology, if you will, is really so prevalent on the campuses, and you have America's best and brightest coming out completely brainwashed by this whole thing. But I'm going to ask you now from the side of the professors, because that's your group. What is going on with the professors on these campuses? Because these kids aren't getting it on their own. Someone's teaching it to them. Someone has drunk this Kool-Aid. How can this be?
Well, this goes back, first of all, it goes back to the 1980s and 90s when Said's book, Orientalism, literally took academia by storm. And in the book, I say, how do I put it? This is a book every bit as bad as it was influential.
Wow, that's saying something.
It's an awful book. It's riddled with errors, both conceptual and in detail. There are whole books written describing what's wrong with it, and yet it hit the zeitgeist right on the head and seized a generation. And it was really, it's hard to describe fully. how bad it was, but basically it was the Palestinians are the innocent victims, the Israelis are the colonial invaders who stole their land and so on and so forth. And he backed it up with a second book called The Question of Palestine and a third book called Covering Islam, which was after the Khomeini's takeover in Iran. There were a lot of negative things written about the style of Islam that Khomeini represented, and most of them were fully justified. And yet he denounced this. Islamophobia wasn't a term yet, but he denounced this as Orientalism and racism and so on and so forth. And what happened then was that the ideologues were particularly strong, and the people opposed to them were still playing by the old rules. So in 2000, when it really got bad, 2000, the Dura story, the Intifada and so on, the sort of, the knives were out. And I remember Dershowitz complaining because he said, I'd go to the people who were in Middle Eastern studies and say something. And they'd say, oh, we have to be impartial, we can't take sides, and so on and so forth. And then he'd go to the non-Middle East studies professors and say something, and say, well, it's not our subject, how can we weigh in, and so on. So in a sense, and I think this happened even more broadly than just in the question of the Middle East, there was a kind of takeover of tenured radicals. That is, as the joke goes, if you can't do, teach. Well, we tried revolution in the 60s, it failed, so we went to the universities. And we basically took over and started teaching our radical, post-colonial, postmodern, neo-Marxist ideologies to our students, who then proceeded. And, here were the liberals in the 80s and 90s who were letting these people in because they did good work and they weren't about to exclude them because of their political ideology. Once they were in, they excluded everybody who didn't suit their political ideology. So today we have these ludicrously weighted departments, particularly in the social sciences and the humanities, in which there are no conservative thinkers. Realpolitik is literally not assigned in many courses of political science because it's considered regressive. So, the takeover of the academy already happened in the late 20th century. And then in 2000, it became a kind of dogma. And it's been disastrous. And, Victor Davis Hanson just wrote a piece about, the terrible shape that the university is in. And it's very possible that this absolutely unprecedented institution that allowed for freedom of speech and criticism and so on, that had literally built in mechanisms for assuring that dissenting voices could be heard, and that the people who published were willing to accept public criticism, could in fact be taken down. Wow. And with it democracy. And the same thing happened to journalism. In other words, once the ideologues take over, once the activists, I would call them apocalyptic millenarians, who want to redeem the world, once they take over, if the liberals aren't willing to fight, if the liberals are ducking, they win. And that's what's happened so far. Liberals have not fought back.
Liberals have not fought back, or conservatives have not fought back?
Well, conservatives have tried to fight back.
Right.
And any liberal that fights back gets defined as
old-fashioned liberals.
Like right. So one of the things I point out in the book is this is a really scary thing. In 2003, Ian Buruma, writing an article about how do we talk about Israel in the New York Times, says, as an aside, he doesn't feel he has to defend it or argue for it. It's just an observation of fact that it has become a litmus test of liberal credentials to side with the Palestinians. And this is at the height of the terror campaign. In other words, the Palestinians are behaving worse than any liberation movement has ever behaved. And all of a sudden, you can't be a liberal if you don't support them. So
Mhm.
that's my quintessence of the disorientation of the West and the redefinition of what a liberal is.
You
It's
think
not,
this can be turned back? Or you think we're at a point of no return?
look, I'm by nature an optimist, and I I used to have a friend who was a pessimist, and I said, it's really easy to be smart and a pessimist. It's harder to be smart and an
Yeah.
optimist. So
Yeah.
I'm an optimist, and I think that it's still possible. There's been terrible damage done, but I think that it's not. I think we can recover from it. We can't necessarily
Mhm.
do it, but I think we can recover from it. But it would take a wave of courage and common sense that
Hmm.
you would- I talk about it at the end of the book, and I say, look, it would be pathetic to have us this magnificent accomplishment of the modern democratic world go down the tubes of something as stupid as people needing to believe that the Jews behave badly. And yet it's kind of hard to see how they could turn this around. So if let me just make one last pitch for the book, which is the book
Yeah.
is the red pill. The book is what you should take if we're all in the matrix. Take this pill, find out who you are, and start fighting back.
Mm-hmm. So since you and I both live in Israel and the people who are watching this webinar very much care about Israel, do you see the same dangers happening here? Again, because the papers have all been full before this government even took their oath of office. Everybody was talking about how Israeli democracy is finished and it's a fascist government and da 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 da. So the things that we've been discussing are mainly pertaining, I would say, in the main to, let's say, the United States and Canada, to some degree to Europe. How let's bring it home now. What do you see happening here? Because we've got plenty of Israelis and a lot of whom control the press that
Right,
also are very much on that progressive side of things, very pro-Palestinian.
right. I mean, if you read the Haaretz, Le Monde, New York Times, and the Guardian
Mm-hmm.
are all on the same page.
Yeah.
And there really is a kind of distressing, I don't know, it's like Israelis are really, they got a tough personality. So once they're set against this stuff, it's very hard to get them off their off their
Mm-hmm.
game. It was I remember when I was doing the Dura thing, and I spoke to an Israeli journalist, Beit Michaeli, and I said, what do you think? He said, 100% the Israelis killed him. So
Really?
yeah, so you have this very powerful, very smart. I mean, one of the things the point I try and make is that these people are stupid objectively, as Marx would say. In practice, they're stupid. In reality, they're extremely smart, but they're so committed to their ideologies that they in practice behave incredibly stupidly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't hold out much hope for the sort of intellectual left in Israel waking up to this stuff. There have been some people who have. There have been some people who have responded intelligently. Betty Morris is a good
Yes,
example.
exactly.
Um, but by and large, the stuff I mean, I get clips from Haaretz on a regular basis, and it's like silly stuff. Michael Sfard and so on. It's just silly stuff, and yet it's hysterical, and it feeds the
That's the
stuff in the West.
that's the
It
problem because it's well written. Haaretz is an excellent
it's well
journalism.
written, and these people are smart. Like oy, anyway.
Yeah. Although I mean, when it comes to Israel, I am optimistic because ultimately we're in a battle for our lives,
Right, right,
and
and that's
we're there. I mean, our kids are in the army. They're the ones who are, or we're on the buses, and because it's a
right,
terror war. So the civilian front is the front.
right.
So, and I
And
think
that's the
last
split
the
between
election reflects that.
Right. And that's the split between Israeli Jews and American Jews. American Jews are still busy virtue signaling. The fact is that when you're in a war situation, insisting that you don't have an enemy is a suicidal piece of behavior.
Yeah.
Now, the Americans don't have to feel this suicide, but they're insisting that Israelis do the suicidal thing so that they can feel good about the Israel that's liberal and that they're proud of. And it's a tragedy to have Americans so self-indulgent, but on the other hand, that is the generation. It's a self-indulgent generation.
Yes, yeah, that's for sure. A very entitled generation doesn't realize how hard people have worked to keep them free.
I'm
see.
entitled to a progressive Israel because
Right.
it makes me feel good about myself being a Jew. And if
Mhm.
Israel isn't progressive, if it doesn't behave the way I think it should, if it shows up, and here's an interesting element of lethal journalism, which is I have an article actually, and I discuss it in the book on what I call the proxy honor killing. An honor killing is when somebody in your family has shamed the family and you kill them in order to preserve the family's honor. In this case, what the media depicts of Israel is shames Western Jewish liberals. They're too nice to actually kill their family member, but they will support the people who will. And as a result, you have Jews who support BDS, and you have Jews who support, any negative depiction of Israel to force it to give up the occupied territories so that it can be good.
That is a brilliant point that you just made. I hope everybody really paid attention to that. No, because really we talk about honor killings vis-a-vis, Arab women
Right.
getting killed, their husbands, whatever it is. But you're saying that it's in this Jewish world also, and you're going to sacrifice us because we brought shame on them because we're trying to survive.
Google
Sorry.
proxy honor killing.
That is really, really a brilliant idea. So what do you think, since we're already on the topic, and then I'll let you go, what do you think about this new government here? Where do you think we're going with
Look,
that?
To be honest, I only have a certain amount of bandwidth, and I read headlines. I don't know in depth what's going on. I have a great deal of faith in the Jewish people in Israel, that they have, we're in a terrible situation. There are lots of ways to disagree about how we should deal with it. I know, Gershom Scholem way back in the 20s warned that if you revive the Hebrew language, you revive a language that's a carrier of messianism, and you can end up with messianism. And you have all these good liberal Jews who cite this and say, oh my God, look at this dark messianism. Ehud Barak on CNN denouncing the dark Israeli messianism and stuff. And nobody wants to talk about the flagrant, vicious, apocalyptic messianism of our enemies. So, the fact is that Jews through history have developed a really good firewall for outbreaks of crazy apocalyptic messianism. We've had them, but given how messianic most Jews are, we haven't had that many, and they haven't lasted very long. And I want to think that we have the good sense not to let that happen. Is it worse? Do I, look at my book and think, oh, people are going to say, yeah, you say the Israelis are different from the Muslims, but it sure looks like you're becoming like Muslims. And in fact, living under conditions in which you're constantly being battered by an apocalyptic enemy, tends to raise up your own apocalyptic counter tendencies. And one of the rules of apocalyptic dynamics is that, one person's Messiah is another person's Antichrist. But I do think that the Jews have shown remarkable resilience in this, and I think it will continue to happen.
Yeah.
One of the comparisons I make is that in the history of revolutions, with the exception of the American Revolution, which wasn't threatened by enemies on its borders, most revolutions, when they happen, end up devouring themselves, end up in terror, and the Israeli revolution was the only one surrounded by enemies that didn't surrender to this terror instinct to go after its own dissenters and eliminate them for the sake of what it saw as its survival. So, I joke that the Jews are the least paranoid people on the planet, because if anybody else had as much reason to be paranoid as we are, they'd be basket cases. And we're not.
Wow, I'll have to think that one out, and I'll sit with that one in a few minutes. Okay, one last thing, because we've spoken about it before. Tell us about 1029. What happened? The year 1029.
Oh, the year 1029. I wrote my thesis on this monk named Adamar of Shaban, and he got swept up in this relic cult and the claim that the saint was actually not a 4th century confessor, but actually the younger cousin of Peter, who held the towel at the Last Supper, and he created an apostolic mass for him and so on. And the day the mass was to be recited, they doctored the books and they scratched out manuscripts, which we have to this day and stuff. And we have the mass that he wrote. And the day it was supposed to be performed, the jealous canons from the cathedral, this was a monastery, the cathedral brought in this really obnoxious Italian canon who tore Adamar apart in public, utterly humiliated him. And he wrote this long open letter, which never got sent out, describing what had happened and so on. It's probably one of the most vivid incidents that we have from the Middle Ages entirely, and certainly from this period where we have very few documents. So that was what my thesis was about. It's called Relics, Apocalypse, and the Deceits of History. And a bunch of scholars are planning to do a performance of the Apostolic Mass on the
which is in just 6 years. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So I see why you don't have the bandwidth for the modern news.
Yeah, it's true. I go from, I'm doing the audio version of my books. I go from recording the audio to putting footnotes in my chapter on the year 1000.
Right. So you really do span 1,000 years. Well, thank you so much, Richard Landis. This was very illuminating, I know for me, and I know for a lot of our viewers as well. And I want to thank you. And I don't know if this is going to come out backwards if I hold it up. What happens on Zoom? Does it come out backwards? Anyway, the book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Global Journalism, Anti-Semitism and Global Jihad, available on Amazon and wherever fine books are sold.
Amazon, and actually, not only is it available on Amazon, but just today they dropped the price from $24 to $10 on Kindle.
Really? Okay, yeah. So it's really a deal. And ladies and gentlemen, very worth reading, really. If we just got a little bit of a taste in the last hour of the genius that went into this book, and a very easy read though, by the way. Okay, really, like almost fun. Like I found myself laughing out loud and I thought this is really inappropriate, but it was fun. It was like,
that's what I was going for.
Yeah, it was like a real book. It wasn't this academic tome, but it was really something with a lot of fine points, but very easy to read. And I think explains to a lot of us, not where we're going, but at least how we got into this.
How we got into this.
And how we got in. So
as Phyllis Chesler said, this book belongs on the bookshelf of every parent who's sending a kid to college.
Oh, well, don't even get me started. Yeah, that actually, you know what, everybody, you should send it to your kids in college, so at least they have an idea of what they're up against. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to all the viewers, and thank you to Shauna for all her wonderful behind the scenes work. And thanks, of course, to One Israel Fund for sponsoring these webinars and allowing me to choose from really the magnificent number of people that are here in Israel, because I only interview people who are in Israel, and their wisdom and their just everything that they do to contribute to our daily life. And so thank you so much again, everyone. Eve Harow, and we will be back. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.